Hi, Scott. I'm so happy that you're able to be with us today in this virtual environment. It's always a thrill to be able to catch up with our certified professionals, even if we can't do it live and in person. So I'd love to start off as a first question. Why don't you walk us through your career path? Did you start out focusing on risk and resilience like right out of preschool, or like a lot of people in our profession, did it evolve from some sort of different role?
Yeah, I actually did not know anything about resiliency, business continuity, or disaster recovery when I started my career. I actually started as a software engineer and focused on Java engineering. During my time, that was during the dot-com boom, and I did get exposed to ideas of uh, recoverability and being able to back up your work. And that actually happened to my team several times where we lost work and we had to rebuild it. So ingrained in me was this how important it was to back up the work. However, it wasn't until after the dot-com bust and a lot of the work went overseas. I started looking for roles that were more in-person type management roles that I came across disaster recovery. And because it was so closely aligned in a lot of ways to what I was doing as a manager in the technology field, I felt right at home. But disaster recovery introduced me to business continuity. And I really loved that aspect of it. The ability to work with different processes, different departments, different people, as opposed to being kind of stuck in the technical area, really appealed to me. And then, of course, crisis management. And so I started off at a grocery store chain called Safeway, which in disaster recovery, and then went to Charles Schwab and eBay and PayPal and Symantec and now at Netflix. So been a great career, I think, for me as far as the companies I've worked for. And just a little caveat, my experience has all been pretty much in Silicon Valley and the high tech. So my point of view is probably going to be maybe different than some other practitioners, but that's very specifically where it's at.
That's a really exciting career path. Certainly being in Silicon Valley is an exciting place to be. Probably a little different from the grocery store chain, Safeway, Charles Schwab, a little bit of a different background there. But business continuity in particular in that area must be so fun because you get to talk to people from all over the company in this capacity, and that's really cool. And in particular at Netflix, jumping now to your current role, I mean, I know a lot of people are familiar with, Netflix and chill night. We're all probably binging more than we're letting on. But I also understand from business reading that Netflix has a really unique operational structure. So can you tell us a little bit about what that's like and what it's like to work there?
Sure. So the first thing you need to understand about Netflix is we have co-CEOs. We have two CEOs. One of our CEOs is very much focused on technology and business, that kind of side of it. But our other CEO is over content and talent and creativity. And both of those directional voices kind of push this really unique narrative at Netflix. So we're able to do creative things in technology. It's a great blend. So what that means for me is I am given the opportunity and the latitude to do whatever I want to do as far as creating a better program, doing things differently, thinking outside the box, being very creative. And I love that about it. So that's, I think, an important aspect to understand about how Netflix works internally.
It sounds like it could be really exciting. It also sounds like you could end up with some sort of two-headed boss monster. So hopefully it was pretty clear from the beginning that that's not how that would work out. I'm jesting for the most part. But when the COVID-19 pandemic came around, obviously this was a major stretch point for a lot of companies, a lot of programs. I'm curious to hear from you how prepared you felt Netflix was, both for the prolonged global work from home situation. What kinds of critical process and assets were you dealing with? Where were they? How did you feel prepared coming into it?
Yeah, and this actually speaks to the second aspect of the culture at Netflix, which we call freedom and responsibility. So when you're given the opportunity and given the kind of the mandate to go forth and be creative and do what you need to do, you're also given the freedom to do that, which means every employee at Netflix kind of owns their role. But there's also a piece that we call the responsibility piece. So not only do you have the freedom to do what you need to do, but you also really own it. So what this looks like from a resiliency perspective is everybody owns their own resilience. However, the visibility into those resilience capabilities are not always really clear, because we have so much trust and faith in this freedom and responsibility culture that people are doing the right thing everywhere. There's no central organization or group to really oversee that. Now, when COVID came out, leadership asked our CISO at the time if we could run our critical processes from an extensive work from home environment. And the CISO said, you know what, to be honest, we don't really even know where all the critical functions are in the company. So therefore, I can't really answer that question. He says, I think we can, but I can't give you an answer because we don't really have visibility into that. So that's how my program started, was they said, well, you know, we gotta fix that. We need to be able to see where we're at as a company. So we ended up doing very well. I don't really think of the pandemic as a business continuity or a crisis. It was more of a project management exercise, because we literally had months in some cases to prepare for it. And we spent a lot of time managing the project beforehand. If the impact of COVID happened in one afternoon, that would be a disaster. But we had a lot of time to prepare for it.
That's fascinating. So it was, you know, I've heard from a lot of people that the prolonged nature of it felt like something new and unique, but you're actually saying that kind of worked in your favor, which is very interesting. Still, I'm sure that it must have been complicated for you not having that visibility into all of the processes enterprise-wide, even though you're sort of the guy who has the ultimate responsibility as well as the freedom to handle this. So that sounds rather complicated. I am curious, what was a particular challenge that you could speak to in that whole process?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head right there. So because, you know, we didn't have visibility, but we really didn't feel like we had the time to do an extensive impact assessment across the whole organization. What we did do was we created geographic teams. We were able to do that. So we created decentralized approaches to manage the organization across the world, basically. And those teams would boil up to regions. Those regions would boil up to the center, the corporate office. Again, we didn't have true visibility onto the quantification or the where the critical assets were and how, you know, capable they were and how resilient they were, but we were able to put into place a framework that we could address issues as they came up.
So it sounds like all of the different departments and activities are sort of decentralized in some way. That sounds like it would also be something extraordinarily challenging. Yes, you're dealing with it around the world and you have all these different geographical teams. Did you find that particularly challenging? Did you have to shift at some point?
Honestly, I think the most challenging part of that, because once you build a framework, it's repeatable. Once you build a team, you can put that team or the same kind of framework wherever. But the cultural differences were actually the most interesting and challenging components to it, because how we in the US deal with certain, you know, for example, just lockdowns. In the US, lockdowns are seen one way. In Singapore, it's seen completely different. So that was the biggest challenge, is being sensitive to the cultural differences. So when we gave, you know, the regional areas, you know, we built these teams out and had them meet and address issues that came up. The issues that boiled up weren't necessarily different in other locations, but the importance in that region was different, and so had to be addressed differently. So it was very interesting. That, I would say, that was probably the most challenging aspect of it.
What about some of the successes? Is there a particular like win that stands out in your mind?
Wow. Well, just getting all those programs built from scratch within weeks, and having everyone so invested and having them, when we first built these teams, we would have what we call an informed captain or a leader of the team. And they came from the business arena. They were not professionals in resilience. So it was to watch them go from really not knowing what to do. And they would be leading a meeting, and in the background, they'd be texting me saying, what do I say? What do I do? And I'd be guiding them, watching over just a few weeks to them becoming truly professional and proficient at leading an activity or a response, or, that was really successful. I think the way that people just picked it up and ran with it.
Well, I'm glad you were able to do that. And I'll share a fun little overlap from my life that you maybe are not aware of, which is that my husband is an actor, and he was actually in Inventing Anna, which was the big Shonda Rhimes miniseries that just got launched on Netflix. And so he was mid-production when the pandemic happened. He had started filming something in the fall of 2019, and then they said, "Oh, we'll pick this up again in the spring of 2020." Whoops. And then they actually did film the exteriors of that in the fall of 2021. And it was one of the first, if not the first, exterior shoot in New York City that picked up as production was picking up all over the city again. And because he was in a scene with a big star, Julia Garner, the paparazzi was all over it. So there were all these pictures of them in the Daily Mail with all of their, pandemic PPP. They had this whole process. Each of them had a dedicated person to collect their mask in between takes. And they had these like crazy shields. And just for him to live through that entire process, because this is before the vaccine, right? Like this was really, really early on in that whole process. So I was certainly grateful from our little run-in with Netflix that whole process went very smoothly. So if you had any hand in that, I greatly appreciate it. And if you haven't watched Inventing Anna, I also highly recommend it.
Well, that's really fun. I could talk to you a lot about that, because I started in February 20, which, the pandemic was just a thing, right? And one of the first things I worked on were strategies to continue filming. And so we came up with things like, I don't come from an entertainment background. So that aspect of it was incredibly enjoyable for me. So we were taking our traditional approach to resilience and applying it to film. So things like, for example, a director will have a series, or they'll have screenshot, or they'll have shots that they'll be doing. I forgot what they call them, but they'll have the scenes, right? And so we'd come in and say, okay, we need to make an alternative set of scenes in case one of your actors are out or whatever. So we had to come up with strategies for movie producing, the whole bubble thing where we put everyone in a hotel and nobody can leave. And, all those kind of things were incredibly fun to do. I don't know how many of our ideas actually made it out there to production, but yeah, that's a lot of fun. I didn't know that about your husband. That's interesting. I'll have to look him up.
Yeah, he plays her real estate agent, Richard Lavin, in the series, which was fun. And that's why they had interiors and exteriors and multiple scenes. So like the interiors with just her and him, those were easier to control, but outside there were lots of moving parts. And like I said, it made it was very exciting for people, I think, to see sort of how filming was working during the pandemic right there on the sidewalk in the very early days. So thank you for all of those ideas. You did a great job, even if you weren't familiar with how film production works in this crazy town.
Right.
But of course, there's plenty to talk about when it comes to enterprise resilience beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'd love for you to kind of take a step back and walk us through, what does enterprise resilience look like at Netflix? How is it structured? How does your team function?
Yeah, so again, going back to the latitude that I was given to create any kind of program that I wanted. We're not highly regulated. We're not, don't report to the FFIEC. So we have the opportunity to create something that is not necessarily a compliance type program. So what I did is I looked back at my experiences in my history and looked at things that I didn't feel were really useful in resilience, or didn't work, or feedback I've received from leaders And again, this is really from the high tech industry, so it may not apply outside of that. But some of the things that I was told by leadership or executives, things like, look, we'll do your business continuity plans, your disaster recovery plans, but we don't really think they're useful. We think if something really happens, it probably won't happen the way we planned. We'll do it because we have to do it, but let me tell you, I think it's a waste of time. I've been told that multiple times. I've also been told that if they need to recover, that they're going to be looking for another job. They can't recover. So, as you know, our tool set really focuses on, well, traditionally focuses on the recovery aspect of business and technology. We have the disaster recovery plan. The BIA talks about recovery time objectives. So even though we are pushing forward into a more high availability space, all of our tools still kind of talk about recovery to some extent. That's kind of where we're focused. And that's not exactly where, in high tech at least, where high availability is so important. It doesn't resonate as much. So the other thing is that I sense that leadership feels that the return on investment in traditional BCM programs are not good enough for them. They feel like there's too much overhead for too little. Again, if you believe that business continuity plans and DR plans are not necessarily useful, all the work that goes into the overhead, the design, the development, the upkeep of a program can be seen as too much work. So I came into Netflix and developed a program that was very streamlined. It was very simplistic. We only look at three things. We look at criticality of an asset. And when I talk about an asset, that means anything that is necessary for the functioning of Netflix. So an asset could be a technology, it could be a process, could be a studio production, a facility, basically anything that needs to happen in order for Netflix to be successful. That's an asset. So we look at the criticality of that asset, which is how resilient should it be. We look at the capability of the asset, which is how resilient is it currently. And then we subtract the two and we come out with the residual resiliency risk score. Now, all of our components are scored from 0 to 10. So criticality would be if you need to be up 24/7, you'd have a criticality of 10. If you could be down for 2 weeks, you'd be 0, right? So if you can be down for 24 hours, so that would be like 5 or a 6. Capability, same thing. We look at what you currently have in place. And the great thing about this is it's very intuitive and it lends itself to self-service assessments. So what we're able to do is we give 1 page of instruction and then we send out these assessments to the asset owners and they're able to complete these because none of the questions we ask are things that they need to be experts in resiliency about. They're just things about their own assets. So I'm going to stop there, but that's basically the approach we're taking. Very little overhead, very little documentation. All the documentation is created dynamically after the fact. So the business partners and technology partners do not have to spend too much time on that.
Very cool. It sounds like you really ran with what Netflix was giving you in their unique culture to kind of keep something new and really innovate in the space. I'm curious, in this format that you've created, how do you measure the health and progress of your program?
So when I joined, the only mandate I was given was to make sure Netflix is more resilient a year from now than it is currently. That was it. Now, inherent to that would be the requirement that has to be measured. So it was implied that we had to have some metrics along with that. So that is a really big part of the program. So the way we measure it again is to identify which assets are critical from this 0 to 10 scoring. That is, we call it the unified resiliency framework, because across the organization, whatever asset you were talking about has the same 0 to 10. If you have a criticality of 6 on a cloud technology, it is the same criticality as a building or a process that's a 6. So they're all very much standardized that way. But the best part about it is when we subtract the capability from the criticality at point A, and then 6 months later, we measure it again, we get a very easy to quantify reduction in risk score. So if my residual risk, resiliency risk was 3, and then 6 months later it's 1, that's a very powerful way to articulate that reduction in resiliency risk.
So it sounds like you were given a mandate that was very vague,
Mm-hmm.
that you were able to translate that into something that was quantifiable, which is always a win, I feel like, in terms of getting buy-in. And speaking of buy-in, getting sort of leadership support is something that a lot of our certified professionals are concerned with, particularly if they're new to an organization or new to business continuity. They know they need that kind of senior executive support. I'm curious, when you're looking for a leadership champion, how you go about finding that person and sort of wooing them into being your resilience champion internally.
That's a tough one, because those people, when you have somebody that is willing to champion the resiliency program on the executive level, you should treat that person like like you're very lucky to have that person. That's not super common. And also, just because that person is on fire about resilience now doesn't mean in 6 months or a year from now they'll still have those as a focus. So when you do find yourself in a situation where you have an executive partner that is excited about resilience, you need to get everything you can right now, because you don't know if that person is going to leave, you don't know if they're going to cool down or whatever. But that is kind of a happenstance thing. I don't think you can rely on that. So I do a couple different things to help me get executive support. The first thing is you need to make sure that that you have a policy that clearly states that the business and technology partners own their own resilience. So I think it's pretty common for programs to have that expectation that business owns their own resilience. However, in practice, that doesn't really happen. We still come to the business partners and plead with them to help us, become resilient. Where if you can, in your policy, make sure that the executive leadership of different areas own their own resilience, and it's codified in that policy and it's approved, you can take that policy and you can approach the VPs that you're dealing with and say, look, if anything happens in your area, you are responsible personally. But then I always say, if you were to give me somebody to work with from your organization and you assign that person to be responsible, I guarantee I can train them to maintain the program, but also know what to do for the first 24 hours after an event. And what happens typically, most of the time, is that VP will tap somebody who will come to me and plead with me to train them on how to do this. So the dynamics shift a little bit, where instead of me going to people and asking them to support the resiliency program, I have people coming to me and asking me to train them. That's one aspect of it. That's more of a practical approach. But a couple things about leadership: success begets success. So it's kind of backwards, because if you're struggling, that's where you need support. But typically with executives, when you're struggling, that's when you don't get it. It's when you're successful that people get behind you. So you need to kind of package your deliverables in such a way that you can hit some quick wins quickly or soon, right after the program starts. By doing that, you can get support behind you and get people excited about it. And then the final thing I'd say about that is your program needs to make sense. You shouldn't be asking questions that there's no reason for, just because that's best practices or whatever. That's the way things are done. Every culture is different. If people sense that you are asking questions or doing things and they don't understand the purpose behind it, you're going to lose engagement. Same with leadership. They're going to hear about their people being asked to do work that maybe, if it's not really clearly understood why you're doing what you're doing, you're going to lose people's support. So those are just a few things that I found that's helpful.
Well, thanks for sharing that with us. I think that is super helpful information generally, and some really good, clear ideas and that people can practically apply right away. I've also heard that at Netflix you have something called the logical risk unit. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how it works?
Yeah, so all the logical risk unit is a way to divide. We talked about assets, right? So the assets are things that make sure are the things that make Netflix run. And a team of people will own one or more risk assets. Traditionally, we've used things like departments or units or whatever. We've used different terms to differentiate these groups of or teams of people. The problem is a lot of those names have preconceived, like people have preconceived ideas about what a department is, what about a business unit is. So we came up with a logical risk unit so that people would say, huh, what's that? Because nobody's ever heard of an LRU, logical risk unit. And it's simply a way to more clearly divide a group of assets and put them in under an umbrella of a common goal or objective. So we might have what's traditionally a department may have two logical risk units because they might do two different things, but there's a whole bunch of related activities in each one of those two things. Or we might have 1.5 departments being a logical risk unit. So basically, it's just what makes sense to group from a response and recovery perspective. And it's not always just a department. It's not always a business unit. We want to be able to better structure our response to an incident that just makes more sense. So we just call it logical risk unit so that nobody has a preconceived idea of what we're talking about.
This is really interesting, and I'd love to drill down a little bit deeper. So, like, what kind of risk assets do the various departments have to consider, and what kind of metrics are you looking at when you're assessing their resilience health?
So again, so risk, right, we call them actually risk assets, but I'll just call them assets. The assets can be anything that we have direct responsibility for if they were to become disrupted. So again, it'd be technology, it'd be business process. We also have vendor relationships, not vendors, but vendor relationships. There's a difference there. And then like facilities, studio productions, things like that. So basically any activity or anything that we do that we're responsible for responding to as a company would be an asset. And so one of the most exciting parts of this program, I think, is something we call the resilience risk control framework. So we have risk controls, but we have resiliency risk controls now that we've built. And they're just like normal risk controls. However, they're resilience in nature. We've broken them down into 3 categories. So we have availability, we have responsiveness, and recoverability. And whether we're talking about a business process or a piece of technology, we have those 3 buckets. When each of those buckets have questions that define the capability or the readiness or the resilience of that asset we're talking about. So for example, for AWS, for availability, we're going to ask how many regions they're in, right? So if they're in 3 regions, that's pretty good availability. So that would be a good score on that question. For a process, we'd ask how many different geographic locations is this process being conducted in? So it's a different question, but it's basically the same type of question. They're both availability questions. Then we have questions like that about responsiveness, about alerts, or about crisis management plans, etc. But each one of these sets of controls, resiliency risk control questions, are equated to a score of 0 to 10. So again, the cool thing about this is if, let's say you have a criticality, and again, criticality is basically the recovery time objective turned upside down. So if you have a recovery time objective of 0, that becomes a 10. So, so we identify how critical we think something should be, and let's say it's a 7. And then we ask these control questions that are specific to that asset type. So it's a process, the technology, etc. And let's say they have a 5. So they have a -2 residual resiliency risk score. Um, not only do we tell them you are under resilient, but we also tell them exactly what they can do to achieve appropriate level of resilience. We say, you know, look, because you've answered no here, here, and here, we'll go in and we'll say, this is probably the most effective way to satisfy your criticality score and come out. We really want your risk score to be 0. The other side of that is you might have a criticality of 5 and a capability of 7, which means you have a +2 risk score, which means you're over resilient. And so leadership likes to understand that as well, because there's an opportunity to make different decisions when it comes to resiliency investment on that. They might say we're over investing here and we can save some money or whatever. So that's, I'll stop there because there's more to it. I can go on and on. This is something I'm passionate about, but it's really been effective in communicating, because we're just saying, A, how resilient should you be? B, how resilient are you? And C, this is the difference, and this is what you could do to increase your resilience, or to be appropriately resilient.
So in order to implement this internally, you really have to empower your team. So I'm very curious how you train the team to be able to go out and do this, and you know, what programs, what tools are they using to be able to measure success in this?
That's a great question. It's been so long. I don't remember how I trained them. I think, you know, first of all, they have to understand fully what we're trying to do. When I pulled my team together, we all came from traditional backgrounds, so it was difficult to get people to kind of get out of their mindset, to get out of the traditional mindset, because this is a different way of doing things. Yeah, I think it just took a little bit of explaining the logic behind it, and explaining why we're doing the things that we're doing. And it, you know, after a certain amount of time, it just makes sense. It clicks. I really very poor answer, but I think it just took several iterations of going through it, and then people got it. Okay, we get it. Now, people that have not had history with resiliency or BCM, they get it right away, because they don't have to overcome that traditional approach. They don't, you know, like, where's the RTO? They don't have any of that. And it just makes sense to them right off the bat. But to people who've been trained in the industry, yeah, there's a little bit of a switching in their mind that needs to take place.
So you're shaking things up. I'm curious in terms of another aspect of team building. You know, what are your hiring practices? What do you look for when you're hiring somebody to join your team?
I look for things that can't be trained. For people that are, no, I look for aspects of people that I cannot train. So I feel like if they have a different background in business continuity or risk, or, you know, all that stuff can be trained. I can teach them that. I'm looking for things that people who are open-minded, people who are creative, people who are hardworking, people who are passionate, really big about passion. You know, what we're doing is kind of ambiguous. And so this program, as far as I know, is not one that exists anywhere else. I think I've looked around and I haven't found anything like this, but because of that, we don't really know. We don't have a clear vision of that path. We don't see exactly how it's going to pan out in long term. So it requires people that are willing to be flexible and they're comfortable with ambiguity, because it's certainly an ambiguous road that we're on.
Well, that sounds to me a lot like a veteran. And we at DRI are, through our DRI Foundation programs, are big proponents of hiring veterans. I understand you are as well. What is it about their training or background that perhaps makes them well suited to this kind of a role?
Oh yeah, you know, the great things about veterans, especially veterans who have retired, especially, you know, like people have been 20 years or whatever, they have such a wealth of knowledge. And even veterans that have not had that much time, but they've still been ingrained in the military way of doing things. And the way that the experiences they've had. The issue that I've found is that the vocabulary, the language that veterans use is different than the business world. So a lot of times people don't recognize that wisdom and that experience because they're using different words. So I have a veteran on my team, when he first started, used all sorts of Marine Corps jargon that, it took us. So I brought him in as, through a program called SkillBridge, and SkillBridge is, internship for people who are leaving the military. And so he approached me and asked if he could, have experience at Netflix. And I said, sure, whatever, that's fine. And I didn't really expect much from him because I hadn't realized about this language divide. So when I would speak to him, I was like, we really have nothing in common. But as he started working as an intern, I was blown away with his ability just to get things done, to be given a mission and complete that mission. His logistical experience, all the things that he'd been doing, I realized, I can't operate without this guy now. So we hired him full time, and I realized the only problem was the words he used and the words we use as in high tech or at Netflix are slightly different. So I just trained him on the vocabulary, and now he's doing amazing. And I don't think he's the exception. I think a lot of our veterans have that go-gettedness, that dedication, that perseverance, that problem-solving capabilities. It's just, very impressive. So I'm a big fan of hiring veterans.
Definitely. We've absolutely seen this through our Veterans Outreach Program at DRI, such applicable experience, as well as with, we had a veteran intern similarly at DRI a few years ago, also like really understands this stuff. But as you said, the language is totally different. And that's one of the reasons why, in particular, I loved working on the DRI International Glossary for Resilience, because this is exactly what we're looking at. We're thinking like, especially during some sort of incident, you want to make sure everyone's using the same language or means the same thing when they use a particular term. It can be such a divider. So it's really important to kind of overcome that and do everything we can, certainly as an institute, to help overcome those challenges, but also ways to work through as we start to reintegrate a lot of these veterans into the private sector, hopefully, and really apply that super valuable experience in this historically tight job market. I do want to change tacks a little bit and pick your brain while we have you about what's next, what's in the future. I mean, we look at DRI, we look through, our annual trends and predictions reports about what's keeping people up at night. I'm curious, what kind of risks are you most concerned about moving forward in the near term? What are you really investing in and preparing for in the future?
Yeah, 40 years ago, everything was, natural disasters or geographically specific type of events. But especially in high tech, we are so diversified. On the cloud, it's very difficult to shut something down by a regional impact. Now we're looking at cyber events. I really think risk that comes from, cyber attacks or things of that nature are really where I'm most concerned with. The type of disruption that can be caused by ransomware, for example, is potentially huge. And I was actually part of, I worked at a company that actually was the victim of quite a large cyber attack. And I'll tell you, the response to it was almost worse than the cyber attack. The way that we responded to it, we shut down everything. So all of my customers, my business partners that I worked with, all of a sudden, all these corporate applications that they were used to using got discontinued out of an abundance of caution, because we didn't know what had been impacted or what had been affected and what hadn't. So they decided to shut down massive amounts of corporate IT technology. So that was and that was maybe 10 years ago. So that was kind of at the, it was a premature program when it comes to cyber resilience. I don't even think cyber resilience was a term back then, but from that, I realized that we do have, experts that are detection and response. We have a lot of architecture people in infosec and whatnot, but there is this gap of how do we support the business during one of these events, or how can we help protect technology from our perspective, which is slightly different than information security. And I think that's an emerging area, and I think it's going to become more and more important, especially in high tech. So that's what we're kind of focusing on as well. We're starting with ransomware, not necessarily protecting. So you talk about spear phishing and other kinds of ways that people are able to gain access or infect a system. We're looking more at how protected is the data, as far from an architectural perspective. Anyway, slightly different than your traditional information security, but is certainly related to it. And I think we're going to see more of that, both how do we support the business during an event like that, as opposed to an earthquake or a tornado. Now it's, the impact is going to be because of cyber events. So I think it's going to be a big emphasis going forward.
Well, I'm certainly relieved to hear that, because I think that if a ransomware attack were to prevent, Bridgerton season 3 from coming out, a lot of my friends would lose their minds. So thank you for your attention to cyber resilience. Obviously, there's the technology side of it, but then there's also the protection of the business and understanding, how you go about making Netflix a cyber resilient organization. I think we're running out of time. So I just wanted to ask you one last very important question, Scott, which is, what is in your Netflix queue?
Oh, wow. I've been on a Better Call Saul kick recently. I go on these binges like everyone else. So every night we watch, 1 or 2 Better Call Sauls. That's what I'm currently into right now. What about you?
That's a really good choice. Well, obviously I said inventing Anna all the way. And if I don't watch Bridgerton season 2, I think somebody's gonna call me on it eventually. So that's definitely up there. But I love that you get access to all these international shows. I think that's just like a super cool thing about how Netflix has evolved over time. So all the French stuff, I watch all of that, like Call My Agent stuff. Scott, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. We're so happy to have you with us.
Likewise. Thank you, Chloe.